I think the American public, including the people trapped in poverty in inner cities, don't understand how literally ghettos were legislated into existence. Do you consider it part of your mission now to explain that, to put some of the anger that's happening that we're seeing now in context?
Yes, we've forgotten all this history. It's not that we never knew it, but we've forgotten it. We have a myth today that the ghettos in metropolitan areas around the country are what the Supreme Court calls de facto, just the accident of the fact that people have not enough income or to move into middle-class neighborhoods, or because real estate agents steered black and white families to different neighborhoods, or because there was white flight. But the truth is that while those things existed, the major reason we have ghettos in every metropolitan area in this country is because federal, state, and local governments purposely created racial boundaries in these cities. It was not the unintended effect of benign policies. It was an explicit, racially purposeful policy that was pursued at all levels of government. And that's the reason we have these ghettos today, and we are reaping the fruits of those policies.
And it's amazing, really. There's policies on so many different levels. There's policies pertaining to loans to buy housing. There's policies preventing you from moving into certain neighborhoods. There's policies about zoning that affect the kind of climate you're living in if you're trapped in a neighborhood because you're black and no white people are going to let you move. So it's really coming at you from every direction.
Yes, there were many, many policies, as I said, at the federal, state, and local levels. Probably the chief ones, the most important ones, were public housing, which began in the New Deal for civilian populations. And the federal government, under the Public Works Administration of the New Deal, had an explicit segregation policy. Its policy was that public housing could be used only to house people of the same race as the neighborhood in which it was located. But in fact, most of the public housing that was built in the early years was built in integrated neighborhoods, which they raised, and then built segregated public housing in those neighborhoods. So public housing created racial segregation where none existed before. That was one of the chief policies. The second policy, which was probably even more effective in segregating metropolitan areas, was the Federal Housing Administration, which financed mass production builders of subdivisions starting in the 30s and then going on to the 40s and 50s, in which those mass production builders, places like Levittown, for example, in Nassau County in New York, and in every metropolitan area in the country, the Federal Housing Administration gave builders like Levitt concessionary loans through banks, as they guaranteed loans at lower interest rates for banks that the developers could use to build these subdivisions, on condition that no homes in those subdivisions be sold to African Americans. The Federal Housing Administration even provided model language attached to the deeds that builders could use to ensure that no purchaser could resell to an African American. So while there was an initial civilian housing shortage in the 30s, 40s, and early 50s, which meant that public housing was built as a segregated policy both for whites and for blacks in separate projects and separate buildings, as that period developed, the subdivisions in the suburbs were built for white families. They were lured away from the public housing. Public housing became all black in the inner city, and these two policies of public housing and Federal Housing Administration subsidization of suburbs are the two major factors that have created the segregation that we know today. Let me give you an example of how these policies persist into the present and their effects persist into the present. I mentioned Levittown before as one of these developments, and they were all over the country. They were in St. Louis, they were in Baltimore, they were in San Francisco. Well, at that time, in the early 1950s, late 1940s, when Levittown and the Daly City development and others around the country were built, they sold for about $7,000, $8,000, $9,000. In today's terms, that would be about $125,000, or about 2 times or 2.5 times national median income. Returning war veterans were able to afford homes like that. Black and white could have afforded them, but only whites were permitted to buy them. Well, today, homes in places like Levittown or Daly City or the suburbs in places like St. Louis and Baltimore and other cities around the country that were built in this fashion sell for $400,000, $500,000, about 7 times national median income. Well, in the intervening period, in the 50 years following the construction of these homes and their purchase by working class, lower middle class white families, those white families gained appreciation, equity appreciation, of about $350,000, $400,000. They used that money to send their children to college, to send their grandchildren to college. If they sold their homes, they gained that bonus and bequeathed it to their children and grandchildren. African Americans who were denied the opportunity to purchase those homes at a time when they could have afforded it just as easily as white families could, they gained none of that appreciation. The result is that today, African American average incomes, family incomes, are about 60% of white family incomes, but African American wealth is about 5% of white family wealth, and that difference between 60% of income and 5% of wealth is entirely attributable to federal housing policy. Now, in 1968, we passed the Fair Housing Law, the Civil Rights Act, in which we said, okay, African Americans, you now have the right to buy into places like Levittown or Daly City or any of the places in between. We can no longer prohibit you from doing so. But that's an empty right, because those homes are no longer affordable to working class and lower middle class families. The white families who bought into them when they were working class and lower middle class moved up the economic ladder as a result of their opportunity to live in places like that, and black families were prohibited from doing so. So simply giving people now the right to live anywhere they please is an empty right, because the economics have changed so much in the last 50 years.
Let's turn back the clock and go back to 1910. You've written the story of a black Yale Law School graduate who bought a home in a previously all-white neighborhood in Baltimore in 1910. And the Baltimore city government reacted by adopting a residential segregation ordinance restricting African Americans to designated blocks. Would you explain that policy and the rationale behind it?
Well, the policy was not only in Baltimore, although Baltimore was the first city to enact such an ordinance, but it was across the country. These ordinances typically prohibited blacks from buying homes on blocks that were predominantly white. They weren't necessarily all white, because our urban areas were much more integrated at that time than they are today, and it prohibited whites from buying homes on blocks that were primarily black. In 1917, and the Supreme Court found such ordinances unconstitutional, not because they discriminated against African Americans, but because they prevented property owners from selling homes to whomever they wanted.
In other words, it was disadvantageous to white people, that's why.
That's right. They couldn't sell their property to anybody that they wanted. And cities around the country figured out ways of evading the Supreme Court decision. Some outright ignored them. In Baltimore, they reacted to the Supreme Court decision by not enforcing the ordinance anymore, but instead the mayor of Baltimore set up a committee on segregation. And that committee on segregation was designed to use city agencies to enforce the boundaries that had been previously set up by the ordinance without using the ordinance itself. So health inspectors and building inspectors were charged with the responsibility of condemning properties that were sold to the wrong race. The Committee on Segregation also organized neighborhood associations around the city of Baltimore to circulate restrictive covenants. These were legal documents that were either attached to deeds or were covenants, contracts among neighbors that would prohibit African Americans from moving into homes previously owned by whites. And this was all done by city government. So this is another example of policies that were not benign with unintended consequences, but explicit racial policies designed to segregate Baltimore and every city in the country. St. Louis, where Ferguson took place, evaded the Supreme Court decision by establishing a zoning commission. If a neighborhood was populated with African Americans, even if not all African Americans, the St. Louis Zoning Commission permitted liquor stores and polluting industries, even houses of prostitution in those neighborhoods, in effect creating those neighborhoods as slums. Well, the GI Bill followed the policies of the Federal Housing Administration. Many of the developments that I described before, the suburbanization developments, were financed actually by the Veterans Administration, not by the Federal Housing Administration. So they operated as one. The Veterans Administration for the GI Bill used the same manuals that the FHA used for appraising homes and for valuing them and for requiring that they not be approved for loans if they were in integrated neighborhoods or if there were any African Americans living even nearby. So the GI Bill functioned in the same way as the FHA. It also functioned that way in job training and in job bills. Initially, the job training programs and the unemployment programs after World War II were run by state governments. They were federalized and then turned back to the states. State employment agencies listed jobs from employers that requested only white workers. And if an employer didn't specify, the state employment agencies would go out and solicit a racial qualification for the jobs that were being listed. So African Americans were not only prevented from participating in the housing boom that took place after World War II by government policy, but they were denied equal employment rights, and that was another reason why their incomes came to be so much lower. They were excluded from most of the jobs that built the middle class in the 1940s and 50s. We talked about suburbanization. It wasn't just a housing program, it was an employment program. All of the construction jobs that built the suburbs in this country were closed to African Americans because the construction unions prohibited African Americans from being members. Now, this was not a private act on the part of the construction unions. Every one of these unions was certified as the exclusive collective bargaining agent for the workers in their trades by the National Labor Relations Board. The National Labor Relations Board did not stop certifying segregated unions or racially exclusive unions. It's not even that they were segregated. There were no blacks at all. Didn't stop certifying those unions until 1964.
So can you talk a little bit about how African Americans were targeted for these subprime loans?
Sure. There were a number of lawsuits filed against banks for their behavior during the housing bubble. One of them, it so happens, was from Baltimore County. Baltimore itself, Wells Fargo Bank was sued by some civil rights groups, and testimony in that suit in Baltimore was that the bank had set up a special sales unit of African American salespeople in the bank whose job it was to go out to black churches and market these kinds of loans, refinancing loans, so that blacks would give up their existing mortgages for an initial low teaser rate, not realizing that the interest rate would later explode and that there would be enormous prepayment penalties if they tried to get out of it. But this was specifically targeted at African American families.
So how do you think the subprime loans targeted at African Americans added to the chronic housing segregation in our country?
Well, many of the families who lost their homes as a result of foreclosures when they could not refinance these mortgages were pushed back into the ghetto. They were homeowners. They were pushed back into living in apartments and tenements in much denser neighborhoods. So it's reinforced the segregation of many urban areas. I mentioned earlier that black wealth is now about 5% of white wealth, even though black income is 60% of white income. Before the subprime bubble burst, African American wealth had risen to about 10%, but the subprime crisis pushed African Americans way back so that many of the gains they had made in the previous years were lost.
So several times during the course of our interview, you've used the word ghetto. Ghetto, I think, is like an offensive word when used to pertain to African American neighborhoods, and I think a lot of people who live in those neighborhoods take offense by the use of the word ghetto. Are you using it intentionally because you see those neighborhoods as been intentionally ghettoized by policy?
Well, one of the ways in which we forget our history is by sanitizing our language and pretending that these problems don't exist. We have always recognized that these were ghettos. A ghetto is, as I define it, a neighborhood which is homogeneous and from which there are serious barriers to exit. That's the technical definition of a ghetto. Robert Weaver, the first African-American member of a cabinet appointed by President Johnson as his Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, described many of the policies that I've described today in a book he published in 1948 called The Negro Ghetto. The Kerner Commission referred to the ghetto. This is a term that we now no longer use because we're embarrassed to talk about it. And we need to confront our history and stop sanitizing our language and talk openly about what we've done as a nation and what we need to do to undo it. And we can't talk openly if we're going to use euphemisms instead of being explicit about what the reality is.
Richard Rothstein, thank you so much for talking with us.
Thank you.
Richard Rothstein is a research associate of the Economic Policy Institute and senior fellow of the Chief Justice Earl Warren Institute on Law and Social Policy at the University of California, Berkeley.